There's a building on Threadneedle Street in London. It doesn't look like a weapon. It has no cannons. No soldiers stand guard at its entrance. And yet, this building did more to make the First World War possible than any arms factory, any general's war plan, or any politician's speech. This building is the Bank of England, and its story, the real story of what happened inside those walls in the years and months before 1914, has been buried for over a century. Now, most people think of the First World War as a story about assassinations, about alliances, about empires stumbling into conflict like dominoes falling one after the other. We hear about the shot in Sarajevo, about the Kaiser's ambitions, about the web of treaties that dragged one nation after another into the abyss. And those things are true, but they are only part of the truth, because every war, no matter how it begins, runs on one thing above all else: money. And in the early 20th century, there was one institution that sat at the center of the global money system, one institution that could open the financial floodgates or slam them shut, one institution whose decisions shaped whether empires could arm themselves, whether navies could be built, whether entire nations could afford to go to war. That institution was the Bank of England. Now, here is something that most people do not know. In 1914, the Bank of England was not a government institution. It was not owned by the British people. It was not even controlled by Parliament. The Bank of England was a private company. It had been a private company since 1694, when it was founded by a group of wealthy merchants and aristocrats who pooled their money to lend to the government during a war with France. In exchange, they received something extraordinary. They received the right to issue banknotes, the right to hold the government's gold, and the right to function as the beating financial heart of the British Empire. For over 250 years, this privately owned institution operated at the intersection of government power and private wealth. Its governors were not elected. They were chosen from among the financial aristocracy of the City of London, men who ran the great merchant banks, the accepting houses, the trading firms that moved capital across the globe. To serve as governor, you needed to hold at least 4,000 pounds of bank stock. To be a director, you needed at least 2,000. These were enormous sums in that era, sums that effectively restricted the bank's leadership to a tiny club of the ultra-wealthy. And what a club it was! The Court of Directors of the Bank of England was a self-selecting body. They chose their own successors from among the financial elite. Commercial bankers were actually excluded from this group for most of its history because they were seen as competitors and, before about 1890, considered to be of lower social status. So the people who ran the Bank of England were not ordinary bankers. They were the lords of global finance. They were the men who sat at the top of the most powerful financial system the world had ever known. And that system was extraordinary. In 1914, London was not just any financial center. It was the financial center. The City of London was the nerve center of the global economy, the place through which the blood of international commerce flowed. About a third of all securities traded anywhere in the world were traded on the London Stock Exchange. When hides and rabbit skins moved from Australia to New York, the transaction settled in London. When coffee went from Brazil to Hamburg, the payment cleared through London. When cotton moved from Lancashire to India, or machinery went from England to South America, or eggs and butter traveled from Siberia to Britain, it all came back to London. The City of London possessed a global empire of its own, with a financial geography even more diverse than the Commonwealth itself. At the top of this financial food chain sat the 5 great merchant banks: Rothschilds, Barings, Morgans, Kleinwerts, Schroders. These were the houses that underwrote sovereign debt, financed colonial ventures, and moved mountains of capital across borders. Below them were the enormous joint stock banks like Westminster, Lloyds, and Midland, each holding over £100 million in assets, each with millions of depositors connecting long-term capital with short-term money markets. And beneath all of it, underpinning the entire structure, was the Bank of England operating the gold standard that tied the whole system together. The gold standard. Now this is crucial, because the gold standard was not just an abstract monetary policy, it was the operating system of British imperial power. Under the gold standard, the value of the British pound was fixed to a specific quantity of gold. 1 troy ounce of gold was pegged at £4.25. In the United States, that same ounce was fixed at $20.67. This created a fixed exchange rate between currencies, which meant that international trade could flow with predictability. You always knew what a pound was worth relative to a dollar, a franc, or a mark. And the institution responsible for maintaining this system, or the institution that had to make sure enough gold flowed into London to keep the whole thing running, was the Bank of England. Now here is where things get interesting. The gold standard was supposed to be automatic. In theory, it was a self-correcting system. If a country imported more than it exported, gold would flow out. The money supply would shrink, prices would fall. Exports would become cheaper and more competitive. Gold would flow back in, balance restored. Beautiful, in theory. But in practice, the Bank of England did not just sit back and let the machine run itself. The bank actively managed the system through its discount rate, the interest rate at which it lent money to other banks. When the bank wanted to attract gold to London, it raised the rate. When it wanted to ease conditions, it lowered it. This gave the bank extraordinary power. It could tighten credit across the entire British Empire with a single decision. It could make borrowing expensive or cheap. It could reward allies and punish adversaries. And because London was the center of the global financial system, the bank's decisions did not just affect Britain. They rippled outward across the entire world. Countries on the periphery of the system, the colonies, the developing nations, they had no real monetary autonomy. Their gold stocks were too small to give them any independence. They were, in financial terms, subjects of the Bank of England, whether they knew it or not. And here is the thing that people rarely talk about. The Bank of England used this power not just for economic management, but for strategic purposes. The gold standard was not just about commerce. It was about control. It was about ensuring that the financial flows of the global economy ran through London, and that the people who controlled those flows, the directors of the bank, the heads of the great merchant houses, the financial aristocracy of the city, could shape the destiny of nations. Now, to understand how all of this connects to the First World War, you have to understand what was happening in Europe in the years before 1914. And the biggest story, the one that consumed more money and more political energy than almost anything else, was the arms race. Specifically, the naval arms race between Britain and Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II came to power in 1888 with grand ambitions. He wanted Germany to be a world power, not just a European one. He called his vision Weltpolitik, world policy, and at the heart of it was a plan to build a navy that could challenge British supremacy at sea. The man behind this plan was Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who, beginning in 1897, pushed through a series of naval laws that authorized the construction of an ever-growing fleet of warships. Tirpitz did not actually expect to defeat the Royal Navy outright. His idea was to build a fleet large enough that Britain would feel threatened and be forced to make diplomatic concessions. In strategic terms, this was called a risk fleet, a navy powerful enough to make any confrontation too costly for the British to risk. But the British were not interested in making concessions. The Royal Navy was the backbone of the British Empire. Without it, the trade routes that fed Britain's economy would be vulnerable. The sea lanes that connected London to India, to Australia, to Africa, to the Americas, all of it depended on naval superiority. So when Germany started building, Britain built faster. The turning point came in 1906 with the launch of HMS Dreadnought. This single warship changed everything. Faster, more heavily armored, and equipped with bigger guns than anything that came before it, the Dreadnought made every existing battleship in the world obsolete overnight. And that included Britain's own massive fleet. Suddenly, the race was reset to zero. Everyone started from scratch. And Germany saw an opportunity to close the gap. By 1908, alarm bells were ringing across Britain. Germany's fourth naval law that year increased the rate of new battleship construction from 3 to 4 per year. The British press went wild. Naval pressure groups demanded action. The conservative opposition coined the famous slogan, "We want 8 and we won't wait," demanding 8 new dreadnoughts. The Liberal government, already struggling to fund social welfare programs like old age pensions, found itself squeezed between the demands of the Navy and the needs of the people. And this is where the financial dimension becomes critical. Building dreadnoughts was staggeringly expensive. Britain's annual naval expenditure climbed from £31.5 million to £50 million over the course of the arms race. Each dreadnought cost roughly £1.75 million to build, equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's money. And these were peacetime figures. The Liberal government, under Prime Minister Asquith, was forced into a compromise, initially approving 4 dreadnoughts with 4 more if needed. Chancellor David Lloyd George included the funding in his famous People's Budget of 1909, which proposed redistributing wealth through higher taxes on the rich and on land to pay for both social programs and naval construction. The House of Lords initially rejected the budget, creating a constitutional crisis. Eventually, after elections and political upheaval, the budget passed in April 1910, and the naval building program accelerated dramatically. By 1914, Britain had built 29 dreadnoughts compared to Germany's 17. Britain would eventually enter the war with 45 dreadnought battleships and battle cruisers in service or under construction, while Germany had 26. The arms race, as many clear-headed observers recognized from the start, was decided almost before it began. Britain's financial superiority made the outcome inevitable, but the cost of that victory, in money, in political capital, in the militarization of society, was immense. Now think about what was happening here. An enormous portion of Britain's national wealth was being funneled into building weapons of war, and this money was flowing through the financial system that the Bank of England controlled. The government was borrowing, taxing, and spending at levels not seen since the Napoleonic Wars. The steel industry was booming. Shipyards were running at full capacity. Arms manufacturers were raking in profits, and the financial institutions of the City of London were at the center of all of it, arranging loans, underwriting bonds, facilitating the vast financial machinery of the arms race. But it was not just Britain. The financial connections ran in multiple directions. British banks had enormous investments in German industry. German banks held significant assets in London. The financial systems of the two countries were deeply intertwined, which is one of the reasons why many people in 1914 believed that war between Britain and Germany was impossible. Surely, the argument went, the financial cost would be too catastrophic. Surely the bankers would never allow it. But the bankers had their own logic, and their logic was not always about preventing war. Sometimes it was about positioning for one. Let me explain. In the decades before 1914, the great banking houses of London were deeply involved in financing imperial expansion around the world. The Rothschilds funded Cecil Rhodes in the development of the British South Africa Company. Their money helped fuel the diamond rush in southern Africa, and it greatly benefited the family-connected De Beers Company. They financed the British government's purchase of Egypt's stake in the Suez Canal in 1875, a deal that gave Britain control over the most critical shipping route between Europe and Asia. Alfred de Rothschild served as a director of the Bank of England for 20 years, starting in 1869. The London branch of the Rothschild Bank had become so financially powerful that by 1825, it was able to supply enough coin to the Bank of England to avert a serious liquidity crisis. These were not separate worlds. Banking, empire, and the Bank of England were all part of the same ecosystem, and the connection stretched further. The Rothschild family acquired the Spanish Rio Tinto copper mines in 1873, gaining control over another critical strategic resource. They provided the British government with £4 million on extremely short notice for the Suez Canal purchase, ensuring that this strategic choke point came under British influence. Every one of these investments, every one of these financial maneuvers, served both private profit and imperial strategy. The line between the two was not blurred. It did not exist. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another strand of this web was being woven. In August 1914, just as the war was breaking out, a partner from J.P. Morgan and Company named Henry Davison traveled to London and arranged a deal directly with the Bank of England. That deal made Morgan the official sponsor of all credits to the British government floated on American markets. Over the course of the war, Morgan would underwrite $1.5 billion in war loans to London. All munitions purchases made by Britain in the United States went through Morgan's firms. Morgan organized a syndicate of roughly 2,200 American banks that together floated a $500 million loan to the Allied powers. This relationship between Morgan and the Bank of England did not materialize out of thin air in August 1914. It was built on decades of cooperation, decades of shared interests, decades of financial architecture that connected the City of London to Wall Street. Morgan's London operation, Morgan Grenfell, was one of the most powerful financial institutions in Britain. The elder J.P. Morgan had been part of the transatlantic financial establishment for years, financing everything from railroads to sovereign debt to colonial ventures. Morgan had financed the British Boer War in South Africa. The connections between Morgan, the Rothschilds, and the Bank of England formed a web of financial power that stretched across the globe. Now, I want to be very precise here. There is a long and ugly history of conspiracy theories about banking families, particularly anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and I have absolutely no interest in giving those any oxygen. What I am talking about is not some shadowy plot hatched in a secret meeting room. It is documented financial history, sourced from the Bank of England's own archives, from academic research, from government records, the great banking houses of London, the private shareholders of the Bank of England, the merchant banks that populated its court of directors. These were real institutions with real power, and their interests were deeply intertwined with the British Empire's military and strategic ambitions. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is how the system was openly designed to work. It was literally written into the bank's founding charter in 1694, when it was created specifically to raise money for a war. And here is where the story takes its most dramatic turn. Because when we look at what happened in July 1914, when the diplomatic crisis exploded after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the financial dimension of the catastrophe was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The assassination happened on June 28th. The markets barely reacted. After all, there had been crises in the Balkans in each of the previous 3 summers, and each one had been diffused. But on July 23rd, when Austria-Hungary delivered its aggressive ultimatum to Serbia, everything changed. This was the tipping point, the moment when confidence turned to fear. The financial markets went into freefall. In the last week of July, a global financial panic erupted. It was the most severe systemic financial crisis London had ever experienced, more severe even than what happened in 2008. About 50 countries around the world experienced financial crises simultaneously. with bank runs, stock market crashes, and market seizures happening everywhere at once. Continental stock exchanges were deluged with selling orders. Banks were besieged by depositors demanding their money. The bourses in Vienna and Budapest closed. Brussels and Oslo followed. The Paris market shut down. In London, the week of July 27th saw a complete breakdown of the money markets. Discount houses, which were the intermediaries between banks and borrowers, were hit with a run as banks withdrew funding. The stock market plummeted. Shares in major companies like Canadian Pacific Railway and Rio Tinto Copper dropped 15% and 24% respectively. Banks hoarded gold and called in their loans, draining liquidity from the system like blood from a wound. The Reichsbank in Berlin was actually strengthening its gold reserves in the early months of 1914, pulling gold from its international positions. French balances were accumulating in London, adding to the demand for liquidity. And outside the Bank of England, long queues formed. People were lining up to change their banknotes for gold sovereigns. It looked like a run on the bank itself. Inside Threadneedle Street, the atmosphere was one of barely contained crisis. The bank responded by raising its discount rate at a speed that was unprecedented. On July 30th, the rate went from 3% to 4%. On the 31st, it jumped to 8%. On August 1st, it hit 10%, a 700 basis point increase in a single week. This was crisis management on a scale never before attempted. On Friday, July 31st, 1914, the London Stock Exchange closed its doors. It would not reopen for 5 months. This was the first time in its 117-year history that the exchange had shut down. The foreign exchange and money market simply ceased to function. International trade froze. Bills of exchange, the financial instruments that oiled the gears of global commerce, became worthless paper. The State Bank of the Russian Empire had already suspended payments in gold on July 27th. Germany did so on August 4th, France on August 5th. Legal gold export embargoes were declared across multiple countries. The gold standard, the system that the Bank of England had built and managed for over a century, was effectively dead. Now here is the critical thing. There had been no pre-war planning for this kind of financial crisis. Nobody had gamed out what would happen to the world's financial system if a major European war broke out. Few states had made contingency plans. Responsibility for handling financial panics had traditionally fallen to the Bank of England, which jealously guarded its independence from the state. But this crisis was so enormous, so all-encompassing, that it overwhelmed even the bank's considerable resources. The government bought time by declaring an unprecedented 4-day bank holiday. During that extended weekend, on August 4th, Britain officially declared war on Germany. And when the banks finally reopened on August 7th, the financial landscape had been fundamentally transformed. The Currency and Banknotes Act of 1914 was rushed through Parliament. It gave the Treasury emergency powers to issue its own banknotes, £1 and 10-shilling notes that would have full legal tender status. These Treasury notes, nicknamed Bradburys after the Treasury official whose signature appeared on them, were not convertible into gold. They replaced gold coins in circulation, effectively suspending the gold standard without officially admitting it. The British public was urged, through appeals to patriotism, not to redeem their paper money for gold, and for the most part, they complied. A young Cambridge economist named John Maynard Keynes wrote a crucial memorandum that persuaded Chancellor Lloyd George against formally suspending the gold standard. Keynes argued that because Britain was the world's largest creditor, gold would naturally flow back to London once the initial panic subsided, and he was right. Before the crisis, the bank's gold reserve stood at £38 million. By December, it had nearly doubled to a record £73 million. But the reality on the ground was that gold coins had disappeared from everyday circulation, replaced by paper money that the government could create without limit. This was, in effect, the end of an era. For over a century, the gold standard had been the foundation of British financial power, and in the space of a few days, it was quietly set aside. The Bank of England, that private institution at the heart of the system, had been unable to prevent the catastrophe, and in the aftermath, power began to shift, not away from finance, but from the private bank toward the government. The management of money, of credit, of the entire war economy became a matter of state policy, with the bank acting as agent and advisor rather than independent master. In fact, this tension between the bank and the government would soon erupt into open conflict. During the war, the governor at the time, Walter Cunliffe, who was described by historians as autocratic and a bully, refused to accept that the bank should take direction from the Treasury. In 1917, Cunliffe actually tried to countermand Treasury orders about the use of gold reserves held in Canada. Prime Minister Lloyd George was so furious that he threatened to take over the bank entirely, forcing Cunliffe to sign a humiliating statement of submission. It was a watershed moment, a clear signal that, in wartime, the privately owned Bank of England served at the pleasure of the government, not the other way around. But it was what happened with the war financing itself that reveals the most astonishing part of this entire story. With Britain now at war, the government needed money on a scale that dwarfed anything in its history. Financing the war would ultimately require borrowing the equivalent of an entire year's gross domestic product. Only about 25% of spending was covered by taxes during the war years. The government's tax strategy was actually modest. They raised just enough revenue to cover normal peacetime spending, plus interest on the growing debt. The actual military spending itself would be covered by borrowing, and the fiscal deficit exceeded 40% of GDP in every year from 1915 to 1918. The first attempt to raise money through public borrowing was a disaster that the government desperately tried to hide. In November 1914, just 3 months into the war, the government launched its first war loan. The plan was to raise £350 million from the public, an enormous sum, roughly equivalent to £38 billion today. The bonds offered a yield of 3.5%, well above the 2.5% on existing government debt, and they were structured as dated securities that would be repaid after about 13.5 years. The government ran a massive propaganda campaign to convince the public that buying war bonds was a patriotic duty. And when the results came in, the press was euphoric. The Financial Times reported on November the 23rd, 1914, that the loan had been oversubscribed by £250 million. The result showed how strong the financial position of the British nation was. It was presented as a triumph, a testament to British resolve, a sign that the money would flow freely and the war would be won. Except none of it was true. In 2017, researchers at Queen Mary University of London were granted exclusive access to restricted ledgers held in the Bank of England's archives. What they found was staggering. The first war loan had not been oversubscribed. It had not even come close to its target. The loan had raised less than a third of the £350 million the government had sought. The $91 million that came from the public was contributed mostly by a tiny group of wealthy financiers, companies, and private individuals. The highest concentration of buyers was in London, with the wealthy southeast of England coming second. But in the rapidly industrializing regions like the West Midlands, far fewer households participated, though those who did had deeper pockets. The vast majority of British citizens had not rushed to buy war bonds. The patriotic fervor that the press had trumpeted was largely fiction, and the Bank of England knew it. The bank's leaders understood that if the truth got out, it would be, as one bank official later put it, disastrous. Public confidence would collapse. The government's ability to finance the war would be severely undermined, Allied morale would suffer, and so the Bank of England did something extraordinary. It secretly plugged the gap using its own funds. The mechanism was devious in its simplicity. The bank made advances to its chief cashier, Sir Gordon Nairn, and his deputy Ernest Harvey. These two men then used the bank's money to purchase the unsold war bonds in their own names, personally. The bonds were held on the Bank of England's balance sheet, but they were classified as holdings of other securities, rather than as holdings of government securities, which is what they actually were. The entire transaction was designed to make it look like the bonds had been bought by private investors, when in reality, the Bank of England itself had funded a huge portion of the initial war effort. Effectively, the bank created money out of thin air to buy government debt, a practice we would now recognize as quantitative easing, though the term would not be coined for nearly another century. To compound the deception, Sir Gordon Nairn later formally swore a statement that all £350 million of bonds had been sold to the public, a sworn statement, a false record enshrined as official truth. And John Maynard Keynes, who was aware of the arrangement, described it in a memo marked secret as a masterly manipulation of the bank's balance sheet. He also warned that it was not sustainable in the long run. Now think about what this means. The Bank of England, a privately owned institution controlled by the financial aristocracy of the City of London, secretly funded a massive portion of Britain's initial war effort. It misrepresented the facts. It covered its tracks. It swore false statements. And it did all of this because the British public had not, in fact, rallied behind the war with their wallets the way the propaganda said they had. The failure of this first war loan haunted the government for the rest of the war. Each subsequent bond issue had to offer investors increasingly generous terms to attract the necessary capital. The second war loan in 1915 offered 4.5%. The third, launched in June 1917, was designed to be the most attractive yet. Offered at a discounted price of £95 per £100 bond, it paid 5% interest over 30 years, giving investors an effective yield of 5.4%. The Bank of England provided advantageous financing to banks that were lending to customers who wanted to buy the bonds, essentially encouraging a system where people could borrow money at low rates to invest in high-yielding government debt. 2 million people eventually invested in the third war loan, but much of the capital raised was simply conversions from earlier, lower-yielding debts, rather than new money flowing in. One member of Parliament, Thomas Johnston, was particularly scathing about the entire arrangement. He concluded that no foreign conqueror could have devised a more complete robbery and enslavement of the British nation than the war financing scheme. He was especially critical of how banks encouraged their customers to take out uncollateralized loans at 3% and invest the proceeds in war loans paying 4.5%, pocketing the difference. And he called out the Bank of England directly for its 1916 advertisement, encouraging investment in 5% exchequer bonds by claiming that, unlike the soldier, the investor runs no risk. Think about that for a moment. While young men were dying in the trenches, the Bank of England was running advertisements telling wealthy investors that their money was completely safe. And what about after the war? The debt burden was crushing. By the 1920s, debt service consumed nearly 40% of all tax receipts. The investors who had bought war bonds, many of them from the wealthy elite, were collecting handsome returns while ordinary workers struggled. Ministers were publicly attacked for having rewarded investors too generously for lending capital that, critics argued, should have been sacrificed gladly as a matter of patriotic principle. The war had been financed, in significant part, on the backs of future generations, and the financial establishment that had managed this process had profited enormously. Research from the bank's own archives shows that most war loan stock was not held by those on modest incomes. It was held by the nation's wealthiest investors, a significant minority of whom made money directly from the war itself. The impact on the broader global financial system was equally seismic. During the war years, the monetary base in Britain nearly doubled, from £288 million in 1914 to £531 million in 1918. By 1918, there were £184 million worth of treasury notes in circulation, backed by only $28.5 million in gold reserves. Inflation surged. Price levels doubled in Britain and the United States, tripled in France, and quadrupled in Italy. The gold standard, which had been the bedrock of British financial power for over a century, never truly recovered. When Britain attempted to return to gold in 1925 at the pre-war exchange rate, the results were disastrous. Winston Churchill, who, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, made the decision, later called it the biggest mistake of his career. The Bank of England, now under the long governorship of Montague Norman, kept interest rates high to try to rebuild gold stocks and defend the overvalued pound. Prices in Britain fell 50% between 1920 and 1922 as the authorities pursued deliberate deflation. British exports suffered, unemployment rose, and sterling became an easy target for speculators. In 1931, wealthy investors and central banks around the world began converting their pounds into gold, and the Bank of England's metal reserves rapidly depleted. Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard for good. And here is the deeper pattern, the one that connects the Bank of England's pre-war role to the catastrophe that followed. Before 1914, the bank sat at the center of a financial system that enabled and sustained the imperial competition that led to war. The gold standard, managed by the bank, created the framework within which nations competed for financial supremacy. The great merchant banks that populated the bank's court of directors financed the arms manufacturers, the colonial ventures, and the government borrowing that fueled the arms race. The City of London's dominance of global finance meant that the money for war, on multiple sides, ultimately flowed through British financial institutions. This was not an accident. The financial architecture of the pre-war world was deliberately constructed to channel wealth and power through London. The Bank of England was the keystone of that architecture. And when the crisis came, when the diplomats failed and the guns began to fire, that same financial architecture was repurposed to fund the most destructive war in human history up to that point. The war cost Britain approximately £9.5 billion, a figure so large that it is almost impossible to comprehend. And the institutions that managed the borrowing, that created the money, that moved the gold, that arranged the credits, that connected London to New York, to Paris, to the far corners of the empire, these were the same institutions that had sat at the heart of the pre-war financial system. The Bank of England did not just finance the war, it had spent decades building the financial infrastructure that made the war financially possible. And what happened to London's position as the world's financial capital? It began to crumble. The war accelerated a transfer of financial power from London to New York that had been building for years. Before 1914, Britain was the world's largest creditor nation. During the war, it became a debtor. The enormous borrowing from the United States, arranged through Morgan and facilitated by the Bank of England, shifted the center of gravity of global finance westward across the Atlantic. Britain actually lent more money abroad during the war than it borrowed, which is a remarkable and often overlooked fact. The British government lent £1.7 billion to foreign governments during the conflict, much of it to keep allies like France, Russia, and Belgium afloat. But Britain itself was borrowing heavily from the United States. The result was a web of intergovernmental debt so tangled and so massive that it would poison international relations for decades to come. The aftermath was brutal. The Versailles Treaty imposed enormous reparations on Germany, partly to ensure that Britain and France could repay their own war debts to the United States. Germany's attempts to meet these reparations helped fuel the hyperinflation of the early 1920s and the economic chaos that eventually brought the Nazis to power. The war debts between the Allies were never fully repaid. The financial system that the Bank of England had managed before 1914 lay in ruins, and the attempt to rebuild it in the 1920s through a return to the gold standard only made things worse, as we discussed with Churchill's costly error. One figure who emerged from this wreckage to reshape the Bank of England was Montague Norman, who served as governor from 1920 to 1944, the longest tenure in the bank's history. Norman was deeply involved in the failed attempt to rebuild the international monetary system. He helped create the Bank for International Settlements in 1930, an institution designed to coordinate between central banks. He was involved in establishing the League of Nations. But Norman's Bank of England was a very different institution from the one that had presided over the pre-war financial empire. Its power was diminished, its independence compromised, its role increasingly subordinated to government policy. The war had broken the old model, the model in which a privately owned central bank, controlled by the financial elite, could sit at the center of a global empire and pull the strings of the money supply. The final act came in 1946, when the Bank of England was nationalized by Clement Attlee's Labour government. After 2.5 centuries as a private company, the bank became a public institution. Its stock was transferred to public ownership. Its governors became government appointees rather than products of the city's self-selecting aristocracy. The era of the private central bank, the era in which the financial interests of a small group of wealthy shareholders could be conflated with the national interest of an entire empire, was officially over. But the legacy of what happened before and during the First World War endured. The patterns established in that era, the deep entanglement of financial power with military power, the willingness of central banks to create money out of thin air, to fund government objectives, the use of public debt to finance wars that primarily enriched a financial elite, the cover-ups and deceptions used to maintain public confidence, all of these patterns would repeat themselves again and again throughout the 20th century and into our own time. The Bank of England's role in the First World War is not a simple story of heroes and villains. It is a story about systems, about how financial systems create incentives that push nations toward conflict, even when the human cost is catastrophic. About how the people who control money can shape the course of history in ways that are often invisible to the rest of us, and about how the truth, when it is inconvenient, can be hidden for over a century, buried in restricted ledgers behind the heavy doors of Threadneedle Street. The Financial Times, to its credit, issued a correction in 2017, 103 years after it had published its false report about the war loan being oversubscribed. The paper acknowledged that it had played a role in convincing the public that the sale was a success. 103 years. That is how long it took for the truth to come out. The question we should be asking ourselves is not just what happened in 1914. The question is, what is happening right now in the financial institutions and central banks of our own time that we will not find out about for another century? Because if history teaches us anything, it is that the people who control the money supply have the power to shape the world. And they do not always use that power in ways that the rest of us would choose. The Bank of England did not fire a single shot in the First World War, but it built the financial architecture that made the shooting possible. It managed the gold standard that fueled the arms race. It sat at the center of a financial system that channeled wealth toward weapons and imperial expansion. And when the war began and the public would not pay for it, the bank secretly stepped in, used its own money, created a false record, and kept the whole thing hidden for over 100 years. That is the untold story of the Bank of England in the First World War. And it is a story that should change how we think about the relationship between money and war, between financial power and political power, between the institutions that control our economies and the catastrophes that shape our world. Now, I deliberately want to end on a nuanced note here, because the people who ran the Bank of England in 1914 were not cartoon villains. Many of them genuinely believed they were acting in the national interest. Many of them were terrified of what would happen if the financial system collapsed in the middle of a war. The cover-up of the war loan failure was, in their minds, a necessary deception to prevent panic and ensure that Britain could continue fighting. You can understand their logic, even if you disagree with it, but understanding their logic is not the same as excusing it, because the system they built, the system in which a private institution controlled the money supply of the world's largest empire, in which the interests of a financial elite were treated as synonymous with the national interest, in which decisions of war and peace were influenced by the flow of capital and credit, that system had consequences. Terrible consequences. Consequences measured in millions of lives lost, in economies destroyed, in a century of conflict that grew directly from the wreckage of the First World War. And that is why this story matters, not as ancient history, but as a mirror held up to our own time. The institutions have changed. The names are different. The mechanisms are more complex. But the fundamental question remains the same. Who controls the money, and in whose interest do they wield that power? If you made it to the end of this one, drop a pound sign in the comments. It will let me know you're part of the deep dive crew. And if you have not already, please subscribe to the channel. We have got a lot more of these stories to tell, and I do not want you to miss any of them. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.